Okay, so the Caples Creek watershed conditions. So this is where I'm going to leave a lot of this to the virtual flyover that we're going to do, but this just gives you an idea of what happened in this watershed. So I'm going to give you a little bit of background about what actually did happen with the Caples restoration project. So the plan was to prescribe burn this project. Well, in 2019, maybe some of you remember, we had some major wind events, which caused major changes across this landscape. Major changes in California. A lot of us had power outages. Anyways, so in that time frame, a couple of weeks before, we had rain, and we started burning piles in the system in preparation for the prescribed burning to happen in the next, 5 to 10 years. Well, the prescribed fire got caught up in the wind event and was transitioned to a wildfire. And so essentially, the entire area, or most of the area that was planning to be prescribed burned, was burned in the 2019 Caples fire. And so, we really saw an opportunity to look at conditions that are occurring after this fire. So although the restoration didn't happen exactly as planned and the timing was a bit different, it does give us an opportunity to look at what happened on this landscape. And if you can remember from our fire discussion when we talked about fire severity and the impacts on vegetation, this is one of those fire severity maps where you can see in red its high severity, and I think we actually looked at this map in that section. The green is low severity, and then everything in between. And so now we can really start to look at, okay, what was burn severity like in these conditions, and how did it compare to our historic range of variability? What was happening in this landscape post-fire? So you've already seen some of the maps of the Caples Creek watershed, so you're pretty familiar with the location. But just as a reminder, here's the location of where the drone took off. So it was just off Highway 88, near Martin Meadows. So that gives you sort of an idea of where we're going to be. So we're going to be looking at mostly down canyon, so to the southwest. Okay, so the drone's going to take off. It takes a little bit of time to move around. So we have to be patient both with the speaker, and then we have some sections in here where we're going to break out into some stills that we can then look at together and talk about some of the effects. So as the drone takes off, the first thing, so if you think about Highway 88, we're on the north side of Highway 88 near Martin Meadows, so like Kirkwood Inn side, across from all the lakes, so across from Caples Lake and Silver Lake. And we are sort of looking right now, this is a little bit to the north, across from the north side of the canyon to the south side of the canyon to the north side. And so you can already start to see some of the fire effects as we move through here. One thing that you notice is there's a lot of area where it did burn very hot. You can see those south-facing slopes across the canyon here. So those were all chaparral dominated. And if you remember, we talked a lot about fire severity, and you would expect fire to consume those shrubs. Now it is interesting to note that there are some cases where it didn't consume all the shrubs. But those are pretty much all along the ridgeline. And then you'll also, I think, notice there's a lot of granite in this landscape. And if folks have ever been on the Caples Creek Trail, directly ahead of us, those two meadows right there. So that is I believe the Government Meadow complex. Right now I'm sort of failing. Yes, Government Meadow. I don't think we've taken our turn towards Jake Schneider. Okay, so granitic areas. So I thought it would be really neat just to look at some stills. So these are photos that we took at the monitoring points that we have stratified throughout this landscape. And so this is a pre-photo, and so you can see how open these conditions are. there's just these really large openings of granite. I actually think on this plot and this day in particular, while we were reading the plot, a critter came out and chewed the tape in half, and we couldn't figure out what was happening, why the tape was loose. So here's a post-treatment picture, and I apologize, these photos are a bit pixelated, but you can definitely see the difference in these granitic areas. So the granitic areas, you know, we saw some mortality, but it really helped to decrease fire behavior across this fire. So it helped to regulate it. And I think I mentioned before, that's what made it sort of a prime candidate for restoration with using fire only as a tool. Here's another example of a post-fire landscape where it was very granitic. You can see that there's still a lot of green trees. It definitely affected some of the understory in some cases where we had continuous fuels. Okay, so we're taking off again. And I'm going to be quiet for a moment and just let you watch. So this gives you a really good look at the chaparral dominated areas. So this is an example of one of the plots that was in chaparral areas, and you can see it's pretty dense. I know there was one monitoring plot that we had in the chaparral that took us like, I don't know, 2 hours to get to because it was really hard to walk through. So this is Manzanita. And there are a number of areas throughout the Caples project where we had chaparral. So this is an example of the post-treatment in chaparral. So this is the same plot location. You can see that most of the chaparral has been consumed. So once again, we're going to start moving here, and I'm just going to let you guys watch. So you see we're panning around here to more of that south-facing canyon. And then now you can see Jake Schneider in the distance there. The green spot. So, and I think it's also interesting to note that in the distance you can also see, well, we'll talk about legacy trees, and then I'll get back to the photo. So I talked a little bit about the legacy tree work. So we had volunteer efforts out here to rake around the large trees. Obviously the photos aren't going to do these justice. I think I may have some photos with people in them here so that you can really see how large these trees are. And so I think one thing to note is that these trees have been here, you know, prior to fire suppression. We didn't actually age of any of them, but I'd be willing to bet they're 300 to 350 years old. And in that previous photo, you could see how there's a lot of trees surrounding these older trees, and those have all come in that period of fire exclusion. So we had quite the volunteer effort out here, and the plan really was to track these trees so that we understood how the raking affected them. If it helped, there's a lot of really good research out there that shows that raking around older trees, especially those that have been fire suppressed, are really important. Here's an individual for reference. You can really see how large those trees are. And they often occurred in groups. So there's two, I think probably a Jeffrey pine on the left and a ponderosa on the right. I could be backwards. But you can certainly see that it was a lot of work for the volunteers to rake around those trees. And we also did thinning as much as we could of smaller trees around the base of those. Here's another really huge Jeffrey pine that clearly was impacted by a lightning strike or fire at some point in the past. And that's another thing to point out, is that a lot of these legacy trees had fire scars on them. So they had fire present in these systems. Some really wonderful volunteers helping out there. And so we're actually monitoring these legacy trees, and I'm hoping at the webinar on May the 4th, we'll talk a little bit more about those trees. So now we're going to fly again. Oh, and I remembered I was going to mention, so off in the distance, you can see there's those openings, those patches, and those are, so a lot of this project area is surrounded by other private industrial lands, and so those are some of their treatments. And that is one of the reasons why this project was a bit more complicated. You know, we didn't want to have any impact on the surrounding landscape. So once again, just for a reference point, that's Jake Schneider Meadow, that green spot. And you can see sort of in the right-hand corner there on the ridge, it's pretty steep. It's hard to really understand how steep that slope is, but you can see some really cool geologic features, some Devil's Postpile type features there on the right. Really, really interesting. So we sort of move in here, and you can see how there's pockets of green trees. There are areas where there are dead trees, and if you recall the severity map I showed you, that really highlights where those areas are located. And there's a lot of granite, so it can be a little misleading because a lot of these areas were open to begin with. They maybe had, an individual tree or two per acre. So this is one of the more high severity patches. You can see a sugar pine popping out of that the one patch right here. And then we're going to pan around. So a lot of I think we have one more opportunity to look at that, but meadows are another important component here. So this is Jake Schneider Meadow. So this is post-fire. So you can see that it did burn, adjacent to the meadow, probably in the meadow as well. Most of the meadow was dormant at the time of the fire. But I was out there early season and late season last year, and the meadows look amazing. I think it really did help. Another really cool aspect out here is aspen. These are aspen resprouts, which I think is really interesting. We sort of have, I wouldn't say limited knowledge on how prescribed fire or how lower intensity fire affects aspen, but aspen is typically associated with high severity fires. So it kills, top kills all of the mature trees, and then it triggers a response from the sprouts. But we are seeing aspen resprouting, which I think is pretty interesting. Okay, so I think now we're turning around, and I think we're have a couple more minutes where we're gonna look at some of these higher severity patches. So you can see there's very obvious patches across this landscape. And it would be really interesting, and I've been out there now, since it's been a year post-fire, and a lot of the areas that in this imagery are not green are green again. So it triggered a response of understory vegetation as well, which isn't apparent here yet because this was flown at the end of 2019, so